This is Carl Ackerman, host of Journeys of the Mind, and we welcome today Professor Nancy Williams from the Claremont Colleges. And these are many colleges: Pomona, Scripps, Claremont McKenna, Harvey Mudd, and Pitzer. And I will let her tell us which one of those are the main campuses for her. But before we begin, I just wanted to tell Professor Williams a story. And that story is that I had a friend who sent his four children to respectively Harvard, MIT, Stanford, and Claremont McKenna. And he told me, as he found out that my own daughter was going to Claremont McKenna, that Claremont McKenna offered the best education of those four special and redeemed in America colleges. But hello, Professor Nancy Williams.
Thank you very much, and hello, Carl. It's a pleasure to speak to you today. Um, I teach in the Department of Natural Sciences of Scripps and Pitzer College, but since 2003, which is when I was hired here at the Claremont Colleges, I've also been a professor at Claremont McKenna College. And our department is sort of separating in two at the moment, and I am going with the Scripps and Pitzer contingent, and there's a new department across the street for Claremont McKenna College Science. And I have friends and colleagues in that other department, and we will continue to have good interpersonal relationships. As I say, they're just across the street. But my students are overwhelmingly from Scripps and Pitzer these days.
Well, I want to get some of your background. What made you interested in chemistry and going to what is known as a liberal arts college?
First, chemistry. I was interested in science from a very, very young age. I learned to read when I was a very little kid. My mom taught me to read as soon as I was able, and I just naturally gravitated toward it. I think it was always really encouraged by my parents. I come to find out later in life that my father was a pharmacist and his father before him. So they chemistry has run in our family, and I think I was encouraged in that growing up. I got a chemistry set when I was a little kid. It was back when you could blow more things up and poison yourself more effectively with chemistry sets than you can today. But they get less fun, but also safer. There's a trade-off there. I don't know. I do sometimes wonder how much that might have been different if I had been assigned female at birth. But I was always encouraged to learn and to read, and in particular in science. And chemistry was among the many things that I loved. And when I got to high school, I had an amazing high school teacher in chemistry who I think just really lit that passion. And it was a combination of something that I loved and something that I seemed to be pretty good at. And when I got to college, I was thinking I might major in both chemistry and physics and was very, very quickly disabused of that notion. There was no way I was going to be able to take all of those classes and all of those labs. But loved the chemistry faculty and the students studying chemistry. It was a community I really felt at home in, and the rest is history. I went to my undergraduate education at Harvey Mudd College in the Claremont Colleges, and so I got to see the liberal arts education up close, and firmly came to believe in it. That broad education, I think, teaches you to not only learn broadly, but to learn adaptively, so that as new things come your way, both in your field and outside of it, you're constantly learning throughout your life, and you're able to make connections between ideas and people and mental constructs and models that I think is just a healthy way to be able to build your continuing education throughout your entire life.
I was very pleased to learn that, outside of the chemistry field, you enjoy reading history, which is my field. So that's really a joy. I want to ask you, what's your daily life like? And as the sort of subtext of this program, what's it like today in 2026 when education seems to be defending itself on so many fronts? What's your daily life like, and how do you answer all those emails, and how do you do everything? And what's a day in the life of a chemistry professor like in the Claremont colleges?
We do a mixture of teaching, research, and service, and teaching is the most important thing I do. I'm teaching two classes, and that's a fairly normal load for us, teaching two classes in a given term. So that means that I'm in the classroom about 6 hours a week. And then I'm meeting with students for about another 6 hours who are in that class as part of regular meetings for that class. So every group of 4 students, I have a time set aside to meet with each group of 4 students. And then on top of that, I'm on various committees. That's the service part, and get to go to various meetings like we all do in all of our careers. And then also, I work with some students in some student centered research where the focus is, yes, on adding to our knowledge as human beings and pushing back those frontiers of science, but first and foremost on training those undergraduates to do science and to be scientists themselves. So it really is an education forward form of research. Where we're trying to answer new questions, but we're doing it in a way that really centers the education of budding new scientists. And yes, a lot of it turns into emails and conversations with colleagues about how do you teach this and how do you teach that. I have one colleague from physics who's sitting in on one of my classes this semester. And so we've been having a lot of conversations about, frankly, how I could be teaching better. And how I could make this line of argument make more sense or more congruent with how it's taught in physics. Um, so those conversations are a joy. But a lot of the day is just meeting students, answering emails, going to meetings, figuring out what I'm teaching for my class tomorrow, figuring out the handouts that I want to put together, writing homework assignments, all of those good things. Just keeping the engine running on those classes is a lot of administrivia.
How do you approach the whole notion that's, currently facing chemists and especially professors of chemistry, where they have to sign sort of a loyalty oath, not to include diversity, equity, and inclusion in your grants, and because chemists, from what I understand, work with the pharmaceutical industry in developing things, new drugs. Of course, my mother benefited from the invention of penicillin. I mean, it saved her life. So how do you deal with this, new regulations about really signing a loyalty statement about not having any DEI in your class, DEI in your sections, and this whole notion, and that term, diversity, equity, inclusion, seems rather something that you would want to do anyway, because you want various ideas from people who perhaps have different backgrounds. And I remember my own daughter using that term when she was describing going to a conference, and it was diverse because there were students from UCLA and Pomona and University of Illinois, and what's going on? And how do you approach this with your students?
Well, it doesn't affect me so much personally. And the reason for that is that I do not live off of grants. Being at a small liberal arts college um, and a group of liberal arts colleges that are relatively well heeled, I'm able to function on internal money pretty well, and occasionally relying on the Bank of Nancy to fund some things. I invariably need to buy more things than I have funds for in a given year, and I'm not ashamed to write a check for them now and again. But I don't rely on federal grants. I don't have people whose salaries depend on me pulling in that money. So I'm not having to sign those loyalty oaths myself. And we have not had the level of scrutiny that some institutions have had of people picking through your syllabus and trying to decide what is and is not forbidden content. Um, Also, teaching in a chemistry course, it perhaps is less suspect to those of our overlords who would like to police it for forbidden content. I think the way that most people that I talk to in the field are navigating it is that DEI has been elevated by this current administration and by the ideologues that back it into an imagined cluster of things. And so what they object to is largely things that don't exist. They imagine that we are hiring on quotas. They imagine that we are going out of our way to hire people who have certain demographic characteristics, or that we actively tell our white students or our male students that they aren't as good as the other students or aren't as valuable. And of course, we don't do any of those things. And so if you simply describe what you're actually doing and don't use the forbidden words, it seems to alleviate most of those problems for most people. The bigger challenge that I see is that in a lot of grants, they have gone specifically after programs, and they've done that with um, a very broad lens. They've gone over an enormous number of grants and programs and killed things that I don't think could even reasonably be included in DEI, but they've decided that somehow it's forbidden, and so those line items have been struck. And the reality is that those programs have just ceased to exist. The bigger problem, I think, has been the deeper cuts that they are making to funding across science, and the ways in which they are simply slashing these grants to the bone. We have, since World War II, really been world leaders in scientific research in the United States, and that has come from governmental funding. And we just now see that flow of water being reduced to a trickle. And so where it impacts us at the small liberal arts college is that our students don't have opportunities to go on to graduate level research. They don't have the opportunities to go on to a PhD because nobody can pay their salary because those grants aren't out there. Harvard is accepting 5 students in chemistry this year. And they're not alone. There's a number of institutions that have cut their number of incoming graduate students way back. We're losing a generation of highly trained PhD students who will go on to be leaders in industry, leaders in national laboratories, leaders in academia. There's just going to be a missing cohort. And the damage that they're doing to these institutions is generational, because the infrastructure that supports this graduate level research, which is what makes our great research universities function, is being cut to the bone. So all of the staff that make that engine run are also seeing their salaries threatened, and you can't rebuild Rome in a day.
I really don't understand how this policy, which is, putting all these restrictions on science, hopes to get the kind of pharmaceutical breakthroughs. And not only that, I know our current president is very interested in minerals, and and minerals are, for organic chemists is what they focus on, I think, if I'm not mistaken. And so, and there are always these new kind of research ideas that try to get at using minerals like iron to get at new forms of synthesis. And and iron, of course, is in dirt, so it's multifaceted, and you don't have to use like silver and gold and all these sort of things that cost so much money. And and this is putting a stop to this, so it's kind of like counterproductive. Am I right here? Is this just, I mean, is this just crazy?
You're not wrong that they are killing the goose that lays the golden egg. Um, and I think the answer is that they don't care, and they engage in a lot of magical thinking. Um, this is an administration, and I think a movement that is driven by their id and their hatreds. And one of the things that they really dislike, um, is academia, and so they want to drown the baby in the bathtub, and they kind of don't care what the downstream effects are, or they think that the benefits will still flow. Um, but they are doing an enormous amount of damage with no real regard for the future.
When you mentioned universities across the board, when you were talking to your former students, some of whom may be at large research institutes, not liberal arts colleges,
Mm-hmm.
smaller, what are they saying? What are they telling you?
They're saying that they're scared for how this is going to impact the university and the entire system. The money that funds graduate students not only makes it possible for people to do PhDs in the natural sciences, but that money funds the University of Los Angeles or the University of California at Los Angeles, right? UCLA functions because that money is flowing in from STEM. And so the undergraduate education at our nation's university is under threat because this is hitting the budget at the bottom line. So it's both, I can't run my research group like this. And we can't run our university like this. There's real questions for how long we can sustain the educational system that we have built in the United States that used to be mostly taxpayer funded. Back in the Paleoterific, the University of California was largely funded by the state of California. And these days, it's mostly funded by grant money and tuition. And you can't jack up that tuition any further. Those students are already going deeply into debt. An undergraduate education is phenomenally expensive, even at a state school. There's only so much you can squeeze an 18-year-old and their families, and they've been squeezed. So unless money is going to start flowing in from the states, it's got to come from the federal government. And these institutions can't survive without that lifeblood of research money.
I remember in the 60s, especially after well, the 50s, when Sputnik was launched, two things happened. One was a lot of money started being poured into mathematic education because we had reports a little bit later called "The Nation at Risk," saying how abysmal our science and math scores were. But also, in a funny way, the Cold War benefited me in the 60s and 70s and 80s as a historian of Russia because they poured money into creating a really well-educated group of people who could counter the Soviet threat, and as a result. The Soviet Union, people got good advice from advisors, and as a result, the Soviet Union fell, and Ronald Reagan was, credited for this. And so, it seems that if I were a politician, I would want to give a lot of money to the sciences these days, not because of the same sort of Cold War mentality, but because of all the things that are done in research. Let me get back to you for another question. What is, getting off the larger plane, but on a smaller plane, what is it that gives you most pleasure about teaching at the Claremont colleges? And how do you manage this given your career, your marriage, and your child? I mean, how do you do that?
Fortunately, I only have two full-time jobs: my family and my career. Um, but yeah, to begin at the beginning, what gives me the most joy is simply being able to teach students in small groups. I love working with students and helping them wrestle with problems, and I think that it is in that struggle that you see their understanding building, right? And so one of the things that I enjoy about being in a small environment is that I can work with four students at a table who are trying to solve a problem and help dispel misunderstandings or provide another way of understanding something and see that light bulb come on, see those connections made, and really feel like I'm making a difference in their understanding the subject material that we're trying to learn, and also teaching them how to connect ideas or how to construct mental models of things. And in chemistry, it's very often mental models of things you can't see. And that is a really powerful set of skills, and I enjoy helping young people develop those skills and abilities in some really formative years as they're figuring out what they love, they're figuring out what they're good at, they're figuring out what they can do to earn a living, and they're trying to find the Venn diagram intersection of those three things. And sometimes they even find it in chemistry, but I'm also thrilled when they find it somewhere else, to just be able to help them in that really transition from living with your family at home traditionally to living on your own and trying to start a career. It's a rite of passage into adulthood, and it's wonderful to be part of it. And being at the Claremont Colleges, I get to do that on a small enough scale that I feel like I get to be in on the ground with my hands in the dirt, helping those plants grow in a way that I wouldn't be doing if I was lecturing to 275 people, which is what happened at the University of Washington, where I got an amazing graduate education. But the undergraduate education was really relying on those of us who are graduate students trying to do a really good job in our room full of 30 students. And I get to do that as a professor in a room full of 30 students here. And that's really special. How I balance it? Well, thankfully, at this stage in my career, I've gotten good enough at teaching that I can cut back the hours of revamping those classes every year because the class is pretty good. And so I can spend fewer hours tinkering each year and more hours doing all of the other things that are on my to-do list because I really do have to restrict myself to 5 9-hour days a week because I've got to be home with my 20-month-old, and I want to be home with my spouse as much as I can be. And so weekends and evenings and mornings are really dedicated completely to my family, and I basically don't work home at home other than a little bit here and there on the weekends when um, my kid is napping. And I really try to pack it in my 8 to 5. And I've gotten efficient enough at this stage of my career to be able to do so. I do less committee work than I was doing before my baby was born. Um, I was doing quite a lot of it in the previous years, in no small part because I felt like as a trans woman on campus, I had a unique voice and a lot to contribute to a lot of the conversations we were having on campus. And I also had built up a lot of skills in things like the hiring process. I'd served on many, many, many searches. And so, to toot my own horn, I like to think that I was really good at helping us hire the best possible people. And so I served in a lot of those capacities. And I'm doing less of that now. I'm still doing it. But I'm on one search right now as opposed to several. Um, I
So
guess that's maybe how I'm doing it. And I have a smaller research group than I had in my 30s and 40s. I am working with 3 students right now, which is a nice and manageable size.
how do the people do it also that, your students that go into research at various universities, whether that be, UCLA, as you mentioned, or large institutions like UC Berkeley, UCLA, these sort of institutions, University of Illinois, et cetera, et cetera. How do they do it? Because they also have labs that they're working on. And isn't it, especially with these cuts, these large cuts, how do they fund this now? And a lot the monies that they bring in, from my understanding, you correct me if I'm wrong, the monies that they bring in at the large universities, are products that they need for their tenure, especially young professors.
Yeah,
So these cuts on a national level are really affecting not only the specific types of research, but also the ability to get tenure at a university.
absolutely. And fortunately, the committees that decide on tenure aren't haven't taken leave of their senses. They know what's going on, but that doesn't mean that that pressure isn't still there. Um, but yeah, it you are required in order to get tenure to publish, to bring in grants, to do all of these things, and that becomes essentially impossible to do if you don't have the funding to do it. And as you say, to run the whole institution, when any federal grant comes in, basically the university takes a giant chunk off the top, what's called overhead or indirect costs that pay the costs of the university. And that funds the undergraduate education, that funds the labs, that keeps the lights on, that keeps the garbage getting taken away. And so they are just making cuts everywhere that they can. And at the same time, we've got another huge factor that's impacting everybody in higher education, which is the demographic cliff, which is that we just have fewer and fewer 18 to 22-year-olds in the population because we've been having fewer and fewer children, and we're hitting a particularly dramatic demographic downturn right now, where there are fewer students who want to go to college, and everybody's going to be fighting over those students. It's a great time to be an 18-year-old who wants to go to college. It's a rough time to be a college because a lot of, in particular, the smaller schools that aren't as well funded are having trouble meeting their enrollments. And when you can't make enrollments, you're not collecting tuition. When you're not collecting tuition, you have to start cutting everything else, and that's your seed corn, all of the people that help the institution run. And a lot of institutions will go bankrupt.
How about those students that come from abroad? I know people who have chemists I know that have people in their labs, for example, from Cuba or
Mm-hmm.
from Lebanon.
Mm-hmm.
and or from, they could have them from Venezuela, and it's not as if, we're sending, visas to these people who have to, really suffer in order to get into the university, because there are all these checks on them now. They're, highly motivated. They come from poorer countries sometimes, and poor economically, not necessarily poorer spiritually. And what happens?
They don't get hired. The current administration has put a $100,000 bounty on the visas uh, for foreign-born academics, and unless you already have a visa and you have some means of getting that within the United States, you can't be hired. Nobody can pay $100,000 to hire somebody on top of their salary. It's just not economically possible. And so we're just cutting back the number of people who are eligible for the job, and we're missing out on some of the best people out there. They will go somewhere.
Well, yeah,
Somebody
and
will
I'm
hire
sure
them.
there are other countries that will welcome them. So especially, I knew that one of the local chemistry professors in the United States was going for an interview in Europe, and I mean, if they offer him something good, he may go. So there we
Yeah.
go. Well, one last question I wanted to ask you, and that has to do with the mention that you mentioned trans and the LGBTQ community. Do you face any hardships? I mean, I would imagine there would be hardships in the general community
Hmm.
because of the not necessarily on the Claremont campus, but maybe so, but in the general community because of the vitriol kind of atmosphere we're in. And just to prelude this, I always, as someone who taught high school for years, I always remember two comments that colleagues made to me, and one was I was telling this woman that I may have had relatives on the Big Island, Ackermans, and she said, "Oh, did merchants happen to emigrate to the outer islands?" I was thinking, okay, I'm Jewish, and she's associating merchants. And then the other kind of comment I got once when I was teaching, which was, and I just think this is, I know I didn't make a big deal about it because I just kind of corrected them and moved on because they were nice people, but they were making mistakes. Another person said to me once, Carl, you either believe in Jesus Christ or you think he's a Looney Tune. There's no in between. What's your position as a Jewish guy? I said, oh my, I said, I said to him, well, I think it's more complicated than that, so, and Jesus was Jewish. And so, these sort of things come up and they're minor, but if they're institutionalized, they become
Hmm.
very dangerous. So I wanted to ask you about that.
I think it is hitting the broader community really hard. Um, an enormous number of trans people, particularly trans young people, cannot get the health care they need right now. And that is really tragic. And we are a community that unfortunately has been stigmatized a lot. And, anyone my age, I'm 52, um, knows that the identities that I carry have been stigmatized from my birth. And even if we tomorrow entered a world in which there was no stigma against queer people and trans people, I would never be all right. I grew up in a time when I was told that people like me were monsters. And it's not that people aren't still saying that, they are. And when they do, they're punching a glass jaw, because we've grown up with those hateful attitudes and we've internalized them. And we all do that work to realize, no, we are okay. We are wonderful people. We are beautiful, in fact. But when those messages are coming in from the outside, it is hurtful. It is hard. It does psychological damage. It shortens your life. Um, and we know that minority stress is really bad for you. Um, and that discrimination is really bad for you on so many levels, in terms of your happiness, in terms of your well-being, in terms of your success in school from a young age. So it's hitting the community hard. To have a target on you is a daily tax on your energy, on your emotional well-being, on your ability to do your job, and on your ability to be good to the other people in the world. We only have so much time and energy in us, and and it's a weight to carry. I personally carry an enormous amount of privilege, right? I'm white, I'm gainfully employed, I hold tenure, I'm middle aged, um, and so I'm able to escape some of the day to day slings and arrows, but I really see it in the community. Unfortunately, we are at our most vulnerable the closer we are to our coming out date. We have to live our marginalization a little bit backwards. The longer I live as a trans woman, the less I am affected by my childhood, the less I'm affected by the hateful things that might have happened when I came out, the less I'm affected by feeling uncertain about who I am in the world and how I fit into it. Um, but every day there are people who are earlier in that journey who are really being hurt. Um, and it means people can't get jobs. It means people um, are being shunted off from the education or the meaningful life that they might have already had. Um, it exacerbates people's mental health problems. It's really, really terrible. There are a whole lot of young people who are going to go through a puberty that is not right for them, um, and will not be able to undergo the changes in their late teens and early 20s that they were hoping that they would go through. We had thought a few years ago that people like me were going to become the exception rather than the rule. People who experienced a puberty that was not aligned with our gender. Um, but now we're sending an entire generation through that again, and that's emotionally fraught for a lot of young people who are going to have to experience that very, very difficult transition um, through their puberty years and through their teen years without the medical support that they need and deserve.
Great comments from a very distinguished professor. And I'm going to leave you with the last words. But I want to preface this by saying, because I hear this word bantied about, the word woke. And woke, if you look at the etymology, is a mid 19th century term, and I'm a historian, and it refers to being awake, awakened. That's the true meaning. And if you're anti woke, you're anti being awake. And then it became a term that referred to people being aware of discrimination. So
Mm-hmm.
if you're against woke, you're against the civil rights movement, etc. And when I was thinking about this, the term being applied to African Americans, for example, here is a group of people that have been in slavery,
Mm-hmm.
and then the Jim Crow laws, and you turn the wrong way, you're going to get lynched, and you can't get any of the economic benefits of up until the 70s in terms of labor, and so you're not able to inherit as you can in a normal middle class family economic wealth. So you're behind the eight ball all the time, and it's going to take a long time to ameliorate that condition. And so just as you were mentioning, and the heartfelt uh, discrimination against individuals, especially young ones, coming up is something I think we can all avoid. But I want to go back and ask you one last question. When you were at the universities, the Claremont universities, and you walk in and you see the four students that you are talking to in a group, what are you thinking? I mean, you look at their faces, and they're so bloody young. And, uh, what's your, what's that, Professor Williams? And I call you that in honor of my daughter. Publicly, I will never call you anything but Professor Williams, as my daughter did. And one last comment, you really shaped her trajectory, and now she's professor of chemistry, and I just wanted to thank you profusely in Claremont McKenna for doing such a great job. But what are you thinking when you see these four shining faces?
I'm excited to share with them what I've learned, um, and to try to share not only the subject I love, but the ways I've learned to help people understand it, those skills and tools that I've built throughout my career. Um, I think that's profoundly exciting for me, and that never loses its shine. And I keep learning more about how to make things make sense. Um, And I keep thinking that there are more shortcuts out there for me to discover. And I find every year that there are new ones that I hadn't seen coming. And so it's just a joy to help them navigate um, this tricky subject in new ways and provide new ways that water can flow downhill to get to where they would have gotten anyway without my help. But maybe I can provide a more direct channel to their understanding because of some trick that I figured out. And I just enjoy that every day. You mentioned the experience of African Americans and Black Americans in America, and I'll add one thing to that, which is that the way that we have built generational wealth in the United States is through housing. And we built the modern middle class through very cheap houses after World War II and up to the present, through the GI Bill, through 30-year loans. And between the exclusion of Black Americans from that and um, the redlining that even continues today subliminally and existed very openly until very recently, we've created structures that disadvantage people. And as a trans person, it's very difficult to divorce myself from my own privilege in that I grew up in a white middle class household that was able to inherit that generational wealth, that I had all of the benefits of education that comes from that generational wealth, right? I was set up for success in these ways. And now I find myself in a marginalized community. But I found myself in that marginalized community as a middle-aged person and with all of the resources of going through the world as a white, straight, cis dude until that point. And so when I see moments like this one, when I see our community attacked, marginalized, vilified, and tried to be forced out of public existence, I think the leadership in particular of Black trans women is more vital than ever because we learn from our forebears who have been through this marginalization before, who know what it is to be trans, but also know what it is to endure a marginalization and a discrimination that never ends in this country. We learn that the answer is not running away. We learn that we can benefit from those who can teach us a great deal about how to hold dignity, about how to fight back, about how to organize, about how to show solidarity with others who are marginalized, about how to not make it about ourselves, but to make it about all of us. And I think we can pull that from other communities, such as the Black trans community, but not limited to. We can learn a lot from each other because there are a lot of groups of people that have been pushed to the outside, and we have a lot in common.
That's a wonderful way of ending our show. Very eloquent. I would expect nothing else from Professor Nancy Williams. And I want to say in conclusion that this is Professor Nancy Williams of the Claremont Colleges that teaches in a way that changes the trajectory of students. Even if it's not in chemistry, it could be by reading the ideas that are presented by Cicero. This has been a really lovely experience, and I wanted to thank Professor Williams from the Claremont Colleges today and wish everyone the warmest aloha and a hui ho.
Mahalo. And yeah, thank you so much for a wonderful conversation and for our ongoing conversations. It has been a pleasure.